Pioneer Sisters, a Little House Chapter Book. On the Prairie, Chapter 4. The big woods were filling up with people. New families moved in, cutting down the trees to build houses. There was less room now for the animals that lived in the woods. The deer and the bears and the rabbits were leaving. Pa decided it was time for the Ingalls family to leave too. He liked to be in a place where the wild animals could live without being afraid. It was time to move out west. So the Ingalls picked up all their belongings and rode in a covered wagon all the way to Kansas. Pa built a new log house on the high prairie. He built a stable for Pet and Patty, their little black horses. Before long, Kansas began to feel like home. On the high prairie was as different from the big woods as you can get. Back in the woods there had been nothing but trees as far as the eye could see. Out here on the prairie there were no trees at all, except for a few down by the river. Tall yellow grass waved in the wind. Gray-green buffalo grass hugged the ground. Birds flew up out of the grass to soar in the wide blue sky. It was a beautiful place. Laura and Mary found lots to do on the prairie. Every day, after the beds were made and the dishes washed, they went out to play. They hunted for birds' nests in the tall grass. Whenever they found one, the mother bird squawked and scolded. Sometimes they lay still as mice to watch prairie chickens play. The little baby chicks ran pecking around their nervous mothers. Cheep, cheep, cheep. The smooth brown mothers clucked in warning. Laura and Mary watched striped snakes rippling through the grass. They had flickering tongues and glittering eyes. They were garter snakes. They wouldn't hurt anybody, but Mary and Laura didn't touch them anyway. Some snakes would bite, and it was better to be safe than sorry. Sometimes they spotted a big gray rabbit in a clump of grass. The rabbit sat so still in the shadows that Mary and Laura never saw one until they were close enough to touch. But the second they reached out a hand, the rabbit would bound away in a flash. The best fun of all was chasing gophers. The little brown striped animals lived in holes all over the prairie. They would pop up out of the hole and stand on their hind legs to look at Laura and Mary. They had bright round eyes and crinkling noses. Their fur looked soft as velvet. Mary and Laura wanted to catch one and give him to Ma, but they couldn't never get close enough. A gopher would stand perfectly still until they were sure they had him. Then just as Mary or Laura touched him, pop, he wasn't there. There was just his hole in the ground. One afternoon, Pa took Mary and Laura to see an Indian camp. The Indians had moved on, but there was lots to see in the place they had lived. There were ashes where campfires had been. There were holes in the ground where tent poles had been driven. Bones were scattered where Indian dogs had gnawed them. All around the camp the grasses were bitten short. The Indian ponies had grazed there. Tracks were everywhere, tracks of big moccasins, little moccasins, even tracks of little bare toes. Suddenly Laura shouted, "Look, look!" Something bright glittered in the dust. It was a beautiful blue bead. Laura picked it up, shouting with joy. Then Mary saw a red bead. Laura spotted a green one. They forgot everything but beads. Pa helped them look. They found white beads and brown beads. They found more and more red and blue beads. All that afternoon they hunted for beads in the dust of the Indian camp. At last they couldn't find any more. Laura had a handful of beads. So did Mary. Pa tied the beads into his handkerchief. Laura's beads were in one corner and Mary's in the other. When they got home, Pa tossed the handkerchief to Ma. "Look what the girls found," he said. Ma untied the handkerchief. She gasped when she saw the beads. They were even prettier than they'd been in the camp. Laura stirred her beads with a finger. She watched them sparkle and shine. "These are mine," she said. Then Mary said, "Carrie can have mine." Ma looked at Laura. Laura didn't say anything. She wanted to keep those pretty beads. She wished with all her might that Mary wouldn't always be such a good girl. But she couldn't let Mary be better than she was. She said slowly, "Carrie can have mine too." "That's my unselfish good little girls," Ma said. She poured Mary's beads into Mary's hands. She poured Laura's into Laura's hands. She said she'd give them a thread to string them on. The beads wouldn't make a pretty necklace for Carrie to wear. Mary and Laura sat side by side on their bed. They strung the beads unto the thread, one by one. They didn't talk. Maybe Mary felt sweet and good inside, but Laura didn't. When she looked at Mary, she wanted to slap her, so she didn't dare look at Mary again. The beads made a beautiful necklace. Carrie clapped her hands and laughed when she saw it. Ma tied the necklace around Carrie's little neck. It glittered there, and Laura felt a tiny bit better. After all, her beads were not enough to make a whole necklace, and neither were Mary's, but together they made a whole string for Carrie. Laura often thought about the walk across the prairie and about all they had seen at the Indian camp. The prairie held so many surprises.